I want to share something with you that took me years of living across cultures, building businesses, navigating marriage, and coaching real people in real situations to fully understand. And it reshaped not only how I teach English, but how I see confidence itself. Over the years, I have met students whose academic records were so strong that any university would proudly display them as proof of success. And yet, those same students would hesitate the moment they needed to speak in a real conversation. These were not careless learners who ignored their studies, and they were certainly not beginners who lacked exposure, but disciplined graduates who had invested 4, sometimes even 10 years mastering grammar rules, memorizing vocabulary, and passing high level examinations. On paper, they were models of achievement, and their resumes reflected effort, intelligence, and commitment. However, when I sat across from them in business meetings where timing and clarity mattered, something shifted in their body language that no transcript could reveal. Their shoulders tightened slightly, their breathing became shallow, and their first instinct was often to lower expectations before speaking by apologizing for their English. I remember how consistently I heard the phrase, "Sorry, my English is not very good," even from professionals whose test scores were objectively impressive and whose written communication was nearly flawless. I did not observe this pattern as an outsider studying it from a distance, because I was living inside it for 14 years in China while building my own company from the ground up. I did not pass through for short consulting contracts or temporary assignments, but instead established a factory, hired local employees, negotiated supplier agreements, attended long meetings where translation delays could shift the direction of negotiations, and navigated complex conversations where subtle tone carried as much weight as vocabulary. Beyond business, I married into a Chinese family, sat at dinner tables where 3 generations shared stories, and spent evenings helping friends' children practice English after school while balancing cultural expectations and daily realities. Through those years, whether I was discussing production deadlines in a conference room or weekend plans at a family gathering, I kept witnessing the same quiet struggle repeated by intelligent and capable people. When asked a straightforward question in English, many would pause as though stepping into unfamiliar territory, even though the words themselves were well within their knowledge. I could almost trace the internal process unfolding in real time as they translated the question into their first language, composed an answer mentally, reconstructed it into English, and then carefully adjusted grammar before allowing themselves to speak. By the time their sentence felt safe enough to release, the natural rhythm of the conversation had already progressed, and the opportunity to contribute with confidence had quietly passed. What I gradually realized was that the hesitation was not caused by a lack of intelligence or effort, but by a lack of trust in their ability to perform under real conditions. Years of exam preparation had trained them to prioritize correctness above all else. So speaking became a risk rather than a skill. The moment that crystallized this understanding for me occurred when one of my employees reflected on his experience and told me that although he had studied English for 4 years at university and achieved high marks, he felt that a single month of working in English every day had improved his practical ability more than his entire academic program. His comment was not an insult to his professors, nor was it praise directed at me, but rather a clear illustration of the difference between studying a subject and training to use it. What changed during that month was not the amount of grammar he knew, but the fact that he was required to respond in English daily, to ask questions in meetings, to clarify misunderstandings, and to operate without the safety net of silence. In that environment, English stopped being an abstract subject stored in memory and became a tool he had to use repeatedly, even imperfectly. It was in observing that transformation that I understood how deeply performance shapes confidence, because knowledge alone does not automatically convert into fluid action. I witnessed the same principle unfold within my own home when my wife and I were strengthening our communication in English, and I quickly recognized that lengthy theoretical explanations were far less effective than consistent practice rooted in everyday life. Instead of turning our living room into a classroom filled with charts and timelines, we focused on practical phrases connected to real situations, such as planning meals, organizing schedules, and discussing future goals. Those phrases were repeated naturally across days and weeks, which allowed familiarity to replace fear and rhythm to replace hesitation. Her progress did not come from mastering every grammatical nuance immediately, but from building comfort with patterns that appeared again and again in daily conversation. Over time, she began speaking with greater flow because her mind was no longer assembling each sentence from scratch, and confidence emerged as a byproduct of repetition rather than perfection. Grammar refinement followed later, but the foundation was built through usage, not analysis. Another experience reinforced this lesson when I met a young woman whose English carried a remarkably authentic British accent, leading me to assume she must have spent years abroad, immersed in that environment. When she explained that she had simply studied under a British teacher for 2 years, I understood that her pronunciation had been shaped primarily by consistent exposure and imitation rather than technical dissection of phonetic charts. She listened carefully every day, responded aloud in class, absorbed the rhythm and melody of her teacher's speech, and gradually allowed her own voice to adapt through repetition. Her accent was not the result of memorizing symbols or studying complex diagrams, but of living within a linguistic environment where the same patterns were heard and practiced consistently. That realization deepened my understanding that language development resembles conditioning more than intellectual accumulation, because the body and brain adapt through repeated experience. Long before I entered international business or English coaching, I spent years coaching hockey, and the lessons from competitive sport continue to shape how I think about skill acquisition. In hockey, players do not develop championship performance by reading rule books or discussing strategy endlessly, but by running drills repeatedly until movements become instinctive and reactions automatic. When the pressure of a real game intensifies, athletes rely on what they have practiced countless times, not on theoretical knowledge stored in isolation. English operates according to the same principle, because understanding grammar intellectually does not guarantee that you can respond smoothly in a fast moving conversation. Most educational systems emphasize what I would describe as technical English, which includes rules, vocabulary lists, and measurable exam results that can be graded and ranked. What is often missing is performance English, which involves speaking under pressure, responding naturally without prolonged translation, and trusting your voice even when you are not entirely certain. When intelligent professionals freeze in meetings, the issue is rarely intellectual deficiency, but rather insufficient performance training that conditions them to respond in real time. Years of being evaluated primarily on accuracy can create a deep fear of mistakes, and that fear quietly encourages silence as a form of self protection. Recognizing this pattern compelled me to design what I call the daily speaking workout, because I realized that another set of traditional lessons would not address a performance based problem. Instead of focusing on explanation alone, these sessions are structured so that you listen carefully to natural English, repeat sentences out loud with intention, pause to speak independently, and then practice again until the language begins to feel familiar within your mouth rather than foreign in your mind. The goal is to shift you from passive recognition into active production, allowing repetition to gradually reduce hesitation. As you engage in this type of guided practice consistently, your brain begins to recognize patterns without translating every word, and your mouth grows more comfortable producing phrases that once felt intimidating. Confidence develops not because you suddenly know more rules, but because you have practiced responding often enough that speaking feels less like a risk and more like a reflex. I am not approaching you as a distant academic authority whose credibility rests on theoretical frameworks, but as someone who has negotiated contracts across cultures, built a marriage across languages, coached athletes toward championships, and witnessed firsthand how intelligent individuals reclaim their confidence when their training changes. If you have studied English for years, yet still feel tension rise when someone addresses you directly in conversation, understand that this hesitation is not evidence of inadequacy. You were trained primarily to pass exams designed for measurement, but you were not consistently trained to perform in spontaneous conversations where timing, tone, and trust matter deeply. That gap can be closed through structured repetition that prioritizes performance over perfection. If you are ready to move beyond collecting knowledge and begin building true speaking ability, start with day one of the speaking workout and approach it with the mindset of an athlete preparing for competition rather than a student preparing for a test. Listen attentively, repeat with commitment, pause, and speak independently even if your voice feels uncertain at first, and allow repetition to gradually replace hesitation with readiness. You do not need to apologize for your English before you speak, because what you truly need is consistent performance practice that teaches you to trust your own voice. I will guide you through that process step by step, and together we will transform years of stored knowledge into confident action when the next real conversation begins. Stay positive, keep going, and your confidence will grow. Like and subscribe for more support.